First of all, thank you very much, both of you, for this wonderful film about Negritude, and especially, of course, the position of Wole Soyinka towards Negritude. I would like to start the journey into truth from where we are, from the Haus der Kultur in der Welt. When you arrived this morning, you told me a story which is attached you to the HKW on the one side, the Haus der Kultur in der Welt, but also to some extent to the health system in Germany. And I think this is a marvelous introduction to one kind of truth. Could you please tell us this story?
Well, I suppose you need some light relief after that very dense and historic and nostalgic also film. All right, so you want the light relief. Well, what happened was I was on this very stage some years ago. I came to direct a reading of my long poem, Samarkand and Other Markets I Have Known. I consider the market, by the way, one of the most ecumenical and humanity-uniting structures that one can ever think of. That's by the way. So we had Samarkand here, and towards about 2 days before the performance, and I had to be on stage, so I was feeling ill, feverish, knees were wobbling, mouth was dry. I didn't know what on earth was happening, because I had been in Europe for some time for the rehearsals. I couldn't have picked up a bug anywhere except food poisoning, because, you know, there's no illness in Europe. You're very healthy. But anyway, so finally I managed to survive the performance. But by the end of it, I was totally washed out. And the following morning, the management insisted I must be taken to hospital, to the teaching hospital here. And so I was subjected to all kinds of tests. And eventually, you know, I sat there. Eventually, after a couple of hours, the doctor came and very solemnly informed me that I had malaria. Malaria. Oh, so I said, is that all? That's okay. I'm going back to Nigeria tomorrow. I will sort everything out in Nigeria. Thank you so much. And if you want to give me something to take in the meantime, I'll appreciate it. And she said, no, you can't leave. I said, what do you mean I can't leave? She said, no, you can't. You have malaria. I said, yeah. So? So once you have malaria, we have to report it, etc. I said, wait a minute, where am I? I said, in Nigeria, where I come from, we have malaria for breakfast, we have it for lunch, and we have it for dinner. So I'm going home where they understand things about malaria. I said I couldn't. It was a big argument. Eventually I said, listen, you cannot hold me here forcibly. I'm traveling to Nigeria tomorrow. I said, okay, in that case, we have to get the lawyers. So they got the lawyers came, reams of papers, I had to sign an indemnity, and so on and so forth. This thing went on. I said, listen, if they heard in Nigeria, and I was due back tomorrow, I said, they heard in Nigeria, when I arrived, they heard that I was delayed in Europe on account of malaria. When I arrived, I'll be arrested by my family. I'll be locked up. A psychiatrist, traditional psychiatrist, we brought to examine me. I said, then the government will remove my passport, will seize my passport, then I'll be chased out through the land borders in a vehicle with rattles, you know, attached to the vehicle saying, this is an impostor, he never was in Nigeria, we don't know where he was born. And, so I was allowed to go home anyway after signing all the papers. I even told them that my brother trained here in Germany, and I promise you when I get there, I'll have him waiting for me with an ambulance at the door of the airplane. So I assure you, you are okay. No, I had to sign all those papers. So that was my experience at the hand of German health authorities, which was that about.
No, we are very glad that you came back in spite of it. No, I think it's a perfect example where you have a system established which produces reality, in this case what malaria is, on the basis of science, which is an institution, and you have a whole system around these sciences, such as the healthcare system, who implements this institutionally with all these consequences you showed. I think this is a kind of truth system which acts on the role of procedures, which are defined and you have to stay to them or not. Okay, now we leave Europe behind us and come back again to your discussion on Negritude. Basically, there were two points the film develops, perspectives you had on Negritude. The one was a very critical one, basically in the 60s. The tiger doesn't broadcast his tigritude. And there was a second one which was much more constructive or positive to Negritude. And the basis of that, as I understood it, was you discovered the universalism behind Negritude, but not a general universalism, but a universalism which is based in African experiences. And the film discusses this in relation to visual arts. I would like to ask you, could you explore a little bit this notion of this kind of African-based universalism with relation to your writing, your fiction writing, what that means for you?
Perhaps the best illustration of that, or shall we say parallelism, or another form of expression of that universalism, would be the Archbishop Desmond Tutu's expression of Ubuntu. Ubuntu, which extracted from Zulu or Xhosa philosophy, I can't quite remember which, the sense that humanity is one bundle, like a broom, and that if you extract one piece, you reduce the totality. And under Ubuntu, the notion that there is really no stranger, no outcast within the bundle of humanity. I think that's the closest extract I can think of from within African usage itself to the notion of the universalism of Negritude. I should emphasize, by the way, that, and this is often misunderstood, it wasn't that we didn't recognize even the universalist potential of Negritude. No. I think it was more a question of style rather than content. Negritude came out in a very, I use the word simplistic, rhapsodic, and at the same time sweeping generalization of what I always consider a very multiple and very complex cultured society, which is Africa. And what we failed to give full weight to was, even though I mentioned it in the film, the difference between French colonialism and British, for instance. French on the one side, Portuguese, etc., the assimilados, Spanish, and the sort of indirect rule of the British. We failed to give due weight to it at the time for the simple reason that we hadn't lived in Francophone countries. But later we realized that the Francophonie actually, it was inevitable that that movement would come out of anybody who would undergone the French method of colonialism.
Nevertheless, coming back to your own writing, and you also refer in the film and also in different contexts, that you see your writing very much based in Yoruba culture, but at the same time with a universalistic appeal. So could you explain that a little bit in detail?
Well,
and you mentioned that also in the film, that your contribution, so to say, to universalism, or your and African contribution, is that there is not one reality, there are many realities, there is not one truth, there are many truths. If you could explain that a little bit.
Again, if I may cite, this time not from Yoruba or from South African culture, I think the saying is well known, Tiano Boka, known as the sage of Bandiagara, who put it together very concisely in the words, there is your truth, there is my truth, and there is the truth. And this is the attitude, even though he was Malian, it's interesting that this is at the heart of Yoruba culture, the Orisha. The Orisha translate this, the followers of Orisha translate this through their practice of the religion. I've described how, for instance, within one household, you can have a follower of Oshun, goddess of the river, a follower of Ogun, the god of poetry and war, this seeming contradiction, the follower of Obatala, the god of purity and saintliness, etc., etc. And all within the same house, within the same compound, each with his or her own corner of worship. A child is born, and the Babalawo, who's sort of diviner and traditional healer, discerns some characteristics in that child and says, oh, this is a child of Obatala. As the child grows up, the child may decide or may show other tendencies, as a result of which it is divined for him or her that, no, perhaps you should try Shango as a pathway to ultimate truth, universality. And there's no contradiction. The child is not thrown out. The man doesn't divorce the wife for following this other. No. The sense is that if you're seeking ultimate truth, you must be prepared to travel by different routes to begin with. We have a proverb which says, Onokon Woja, that there are many paths towards the market, that universal congregation, the market. And this is something which, of course, has found resonance in many societies when the slaves moved across to the Americas and resulted in the kind of syncretism between Yoruba deities and Roman Catholic saints. Yoruba found absolutely nothing strange about it. Ogun became Saint Anthony, Shokmanon became Lazarus, and vice versa, etc., etc. So that kind of the rigidity which is practiced, let us say, by other religions, it doesn't exist at all in Yoruba culture.
The film makes it very clear that Soyinka's attack on Negritude was just one amongst others. Another position was the one of Edouard Glissant. You worked a lot about, and Edouard Glissant is developing his philosophy on the background of the experience of the Caribbean. How would you situate the notion of truth and reality in this kind of philosophy?
Right. I'm in a way coming from a third generation. You have Negritude with the founding fathers, Alioune Diop, Senghor, Césaire, Birago Diop, and so on. And then you have the second generation with Fanon, Edouard Glissant, and Soyinka. So if you see all of them coming at Negritude in order to force it to talk about African decolonization, in order to go from, Soyinka says this very well in the book, The Burden of Memory, that in a sense, Negritude needed to go past this moment of being a movement. This is very important because he also explained that Anglophone countries could not have created a movement, that the movement itself is part of French modernist movements. surrealism, expressionism, and so on. So they needed to ground Negritude in different kinds of truths from these literary artistic movements. So he mentioned that, and so Fanon, of course, his way of grounding the truth is to say, with Césaire, il n'y a de culture que culture nationale. Forget about your negritude, your grandparents were kings and queens and so on, but it's only the day you pick up your weapons to create your nation, it's through that you will create your true culture. This is, Fanon says this. And then Glissant also was very disturbed. If you look at books like the discourse on créolité or éloge à la créolité, Glissant began to be seriously concerned about the way negritude was being defined in the Caribbean as Africanness defining the true blackness. If you are in the Caribbean or the United States, you see African mask, you say this is the real Africa. You see Senghor, even Césaire was making this mistake all the time. He was considering Senghor as more authentic than himself. So Glissant said that he felt compelled to redefine créolisation, not créolité, but créolisation, as an attempt to show that the Caribbean also had, they were mixed with white populations, with Indian population, as well as African population, so that they will stop seeing themselves as inferior and to the whites and to the Africans. Of course, the way we perceived this, we thought that Glissant basically was against Africa. That's the only part we saw in this discourse. And then Soyinka grounded Negritude even more into what, as readers, we were calling, he called it first, animysticism. Animism plus mysticism. He talks about some of this in the film. So when I was growing up, third generation, we no longer had the right almost to read Negritude because you have Fanon said no, Soyinka says no, Glissant says no. So I started reading Senghor much, much later because it was the bad object. How can you read Senghor? So what ended up happening that saved me was that, well, Fanon, of course, didn't have the time, but if you begin to reread Soyinka, and that is if you read Soyinka, not the interpreters, because the interpreters, you just spend your whole life laughing at Negritude. He called them the Negritudinist. So you spend the whole time, and then, the tiger and the tigritude and so on. And then, you read Glissant's créolité, then you don't want to read Negritude. But happily, Soyinka began to rewrite Negritude. Happily, if you read Glissant to Philosophie de la Relation, Poétique de la Relation, he began to talk about his debt to Negritude. In fact, Glissant was the organizer of the 1959 conference in Rome. So they began to not only acknowledge the debt to the Negritude writers, but also to take Negritude to a level that people like myself, coming out of mostly Western discourse, my generation is post-structuralism. Yes. Yeah. So,
could one say that the major attack from Soyinka as well as Glissant was against this essentialist notion of Negritude?
Yeah.
That it is by itself, let's say, a universalism which doesn't acknowledge others.
Yeah.
Well, I always emphasized the fact that Negritude, if you like, went through two phases, which for me was logical. The Negritudinists, especially, Senghor's side, felt that you must begin by validating almost in a mood of exclusion the African past, its culture, its history, its relationship with phenomena, etc., that it stood alone. It was almost autogenous. That was the first step. and then move from there to say, yes, we have valorized the components of that culture, its history, etc. We have analyzed, we've synthesized it, we've drawn out its essence. Now let's look at it in relation to the others and construct a universalist mentality, approach, culture, but with that propulsion of the blackness, the authentic blackness of the African peoples, one that has been neglected, derided, disdained for so long. And so I tended to look at the trajectory of Negritude from the point of those two stages.
You see, the first part of Negritude, the situation is that the first inspiration of Negritude was Harlem Renaissance. And Harlem Renaissance was discovering Africa through exhibitions in New York of African masks. So the whole idea of leaven of culture, the dough of culture. And then anthropologists, including the great German Leo Frobenius. So these were the first inspiration of Negritude. And what Soyinka, Fanon, and Glissant did was to actually ground Negritude. And this is what is really important to us. But I know you're going to get into that, so I just wanted to say that.
No, I would like to shift now a little bit to another notion, so to say, of truth. Wole Soyinka has this very nice quote by T.S. Eliot, which he grounds in Yoruba culture, where he says, the dead body which you have buried in the garden pushes its truth to the light. The dead body which you have buried in the garden pushes its truth to the light. There are a lot of dead bodies in Africa, and one way to deal with them is the institution of Truth Commission. And could you elaborate from your perspective, since you followed numbers of truth commissions in Africa, in which way truth is established by these truth commissions?
That's a very large subject. We must always remember that, first of all, there's what you might call a specific truth commission. In other words, you have the situation like South Africa, which was dedicated to one of the most prolonged crimes against humanity that ever took place within a national space. And so that was beamed at that crime, but at the same time, it took its authority from what we have called Ubuntu or Negritude, the principle, the belief that there is really no outcast in the humanity. There's a little bit of Christian theology in it as well. I mean, I'm not surprised that it's somebody like Desmond Tutu who was able to extract that out of, certain African beliefs, that a community, does not really discard any of its own once you regard the community as a human one. If I can illustrate this with even something more practical, some of the greatest atrocities committed on the African continent were committed by child soldiers. Those children, and of course, which means that the adults were guilty of that crime because they brainwashed and they corrupted those children, turned them into monsters. And community is very strong in Africa, as you know. And when the war was over, or when some of them were captured, an attempt was made to integrate these children back into the community. And those who had experienced, real bestiality at the hands of those children didn't want them back in the community. They didn't say kill them or anything. They just said, we don't want them in here. The UN Organization for Children Rehabilitation, I forgot the name.
UNICEF.
It was led by Sane or something like that. They brought in European psychiatrists to try and retune the minds of those children, because they were lost. They were lost to humanity, in my language. And they failed completely. And eventually, some African leaders suggested, why don't you invite back traditional healers into this process, take them back to this process. And they brought those children in. They took them through traditional rituals in which they were made to recover their childhood, the child in them, take them through the atrocities they had committed, and eventually these tough, really, drug-seasoned, they were blubbering like children. And through that process, by going back to African traditions, the method of healing, they were able to turn those lost children into human beings once more. That's an example of, let us say, the healing methods proceeding from a very profound philosophical set of beliefs, that there's really no outcast to humanity. And that was the principle that underlined and inspired Desmond Tutu's and his colleague, of course, creation of the Truth Commission. Now, you say the Truth Commissions all over Africa. Yes, some of them work. One is being proposed for Nigeria, for our experience under Sani Abacha, for instance. But it seems to me that there's a larger Truth Commission which is required. And this is the Truth Commission of what outside forces did to Africans. How far back does it go? How far back should it go? Does it go back to the very beginning of slavery, which was Arab slavery, continuing, prolonged, and even made more horrendous by the European entry to the trade? Does it include colonialism? Does it include Islam and Christianity, what they did both in their own societies and what they have done on the African continent, and what incidentally certain strains of those religions still do to African culture, African humanity, etc., etc. Where does truth begin? How do you extract it completely? And then what African leaders themselves have done to diminish the humanity of Africans. So that's why I say it's a very large subject.
Yes. Of course, in these processes, as you mentioned and showed that with the children, which in this case were perpetrators in this process, is that you have, since really personal experiences of violence and so on are involved in this. This is not objective truth in any way. There's experience of many individuals which are involved in that. So the question is, do you see also a role literature or writing can play in this? Because you have to find a language to express the situation. Or do you see this just as a legal process?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one is constantly questing for truth. There's no question about that. If only for the reason that you encounter situations where, to go back to what I said earlier, you question the humanity of those who are supposed to be part and parcel of your own community. And then the lies which are told to sustain totally inhuman conditions, the inhuman relationship between the ruler and the ruled, and you have to ask yourselves, what actually is the nature of the human being, ultimately? Yeah. And I'm afraid you don't ever arrive at any satisfactory answer. If I may, as I've done once in a while, extended Tiano Boka's statement, your truth, my truth, and the truth. And I said, there's also a fourth position, which is alarming, which is that maybe there is no truth. That all we have is relativism. Who knows? I don't know.
How would, since you are really into Glissant, how would this kind of truth, as it is dealt with, negotiated in the Truth Commission context, be conceptualized in his theory of the relation of the poetics of relationships?
Well, as I was listening to Wole, in many ways, I was also thinking that there are some processes through which the truth also hides its opposite. And both for Soyinka and Glissant, and especially in the re-evaluation of Negritude, what become more interesting is that which is not seen, that Glissant will call opacity, for example, and how that opacity began to negotiate with the things that are transparent, that are systematic, that are visible, that are institutional. So these invisible things, Glissant will say, he will say seemingly insignificant, but no less valid and essential to the equilibrium of the world than the so-called more powerful and visible ones. And I brought in my iPad because there is this moment in The Burden of Memory where Soyinka talks about idiocy. For me, it's a brilliant moment about this because everything that is not transparent, that you do not accept as truth, you call it idiot language in many ways. So he says, responding to that, he said, twisting the blade of denigration from the hand of the racist, he will demand, and what do you know of the deity Obatala, the god and protector of albino, the crippled and over-disadvantaged of humanity? What do you know of that mysterious confidant of the gods? The touched by the god. So this is a form of truth, people who are touched by the gods. And this is pantheistic in many ways, whose interior language of communication you interpret as idiocy. And there is always that hunting the truth for me. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yes, you've sort of outlined the real puzzle, the sort of interior language, for instance, of those we consider mad, the interior language. Where are they when they converse seemingly with themselves? And this has been an experience which I've had since childhood. I think I've described my experience with an uncle of mine who somehow, sometimes he'd be in his room and he'd be talking animatedly to people by himself, and the family would peek inside there. No, he's there, all by himself. And sometimes he would demand food for his companions. And they would put wraps of eko and ekuru with him. And somehow, talking, chatting, feasting, by morning, all the food would be gone. And I don't think he was that big an eater, and from all evidence, from the relations. But there he was, and for him, during that period, that's his most intimate, truthful moment. And everybody recognized it. He was touched by the gods in some way or the other, just as some children are treated like adults in Yoruba society. They are treated with veneration simply because certain things come out of their mouths, which should not, cannot in any way be envisaged for a child of 4, 5. I'm not talking about predictions. I'm just talking about really wise sayings. Sometimes he's allowed even to intervene in the council of elders simply because he's considered a kind of reincarnation. And is sometimes given that name, which is Babatunde, that is the father who's returned, or the grandfather who's returned, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, in many ways, for Glissant, truth comes through what he calls relation. And what is important to him in this sense, in this term, beside the fact that he will define relation as linking things, relation as relating a story from one place to another place, or relation as sending something someplace. What is important to him is that differences are crucial, but how do we find solidarities between differences? Instead of only finding opposition between differences, what Soyinka was calling class of civilization. How do we find solidarities? And for Glissant, that comes through a poetic of what he called la pensée du tremblement. Human beings no longer tremble. They no longer shake. They're sure of themselves. They reassured. So, Glissant says, the earth shakes. When he was a child, he used to hear the river run. So he used to speak languages that have all disappeared now through transparency, through development, through other things. And we rediscover the truth, we rediscover the poem by learning, first of all, to tremble with other people. When we hear other people's story, we have to learn how to tremble. And it's through that that we begin to understand things. And for him, once you learn the tremblement, then he can also, I don't know how to translate, a better way to translate this word, his French notion of imaginaire, which is translated in a true post-structuralism as the imaginary, but it's not really the imaginary. You know, so you can't fight terrorism with terrorism. You have to fight terrorism by providing over imaginaries, because I don't have a translation, to the people, over spaces of people to imagine themselves differently. But it can't just fight, because over terrorism will be coming. And then Glissant says, we discover every day that our thoughts and our relations, the most unexpected, the most hidden, our intuition, individual and collective, were at the same time felt elsewhere. Because we think we're so unique, was by others in foreign languages in other regions of the world. This is why he has a whole book called Universalism du monde, because he's trying to think of a world where people actually are thinking the same ways, but these ways are not being related. So we think that they're just isolated.
Like to come back again to you as a writer and also yes. Playwright. One of your politically very much debated plays was The Dance of the Forest. And in this play, the deads come and get alive again. So the spirits are hunting you of the deads. How would you relate this kind of writing on the Nigerian situation as a writer to the issue of the negotiation of truth in the political context?
Well, the play which you mentioned, A Dance of the Forests, which I wrote at the time of Nigerian independence, you could say that it was a precursor of that soundbite of a tiger does not proclaim his tigritude, just leaps and devours its prey, which was a total thing. People don't remember the second part of it. And A Dance of the Forest, for me, dealt at the time, as I said, it was almost like a precursor of an aspect of Negritude which dangerously distorted the truth. Again, this is where the question, what is truth? In what I call the glamorization tendency in Negritude, history was deodorized, completely deodorized. Africans were warriors, poets, sages, etc., etc. But we know that Africa was also a place of cruelty, you know, its history, it was a place of cruelty. Vestiges, or even not just vestiges, but a sort of a replication of which was already affecting us as living beings in this here and now. And I was warning in that play that let's not be over-romantic about our past, otherwise we'll carry those negatives into the present and into the future. So it is the most natural thing in the world for me to take up arms against the excessive romanticization of a past. It was a message which was not very popular at the time, certainly not at the time of independence. The government, which was supposed to sponsor, it was a play competition, the winning play for the independence, said absolutely no way. So we're supposed to be rejoicing and celebrating and so on, and this man comes and tries to pour cold water on the euphoria, you know, and you want us to, no way. But I wasn't saying don't celebrate, I was just saying, let us begin right now. This is a moment, if you like, in which we can begin a serious search for truth, not just about our past, but the possible truth about what may be our present, what we may be carrying into this present, and so let's just be aware of it. And so in those ways, I've tried very hard to integrate truth into the...
In the context of dealing with truth commissions and so on, you mentioned that truth is not enough. You need also a reconciliation process or even a restitution process. Can you elaborate on that?
Desmond Tutu and I, my elder brother, we've always clashed on this issue. And I always tell him, well, you know, the Christian theology, you know, is beginning to, if not beginning to, but it's clearly dominating your thought processes. And I said, this is dangerous. I've always taken the position that, in fact, I think I've used the image of an archway, again from tradition. When a member of society has infringed, or a group have infringed on the rights of another in a really deleterious way, not just fringe, you know, marginal crimes against them, but serious ways. When the reconciliation process begins, there are certain rituals which put into effect. There's, for instance, the community, or maybe just the violators, pass through an archway, considered an archway of healing, an archway, whether physical healing or spiritual healing, they pass through an archway. And after I had to look, but that's only after discussion. After discussion where one side has admitted the truth, you know, and the other has shown willing to let the past be. And I've tried to describe that archway as being made up of truth on one side, and reconciliation, one half of the archway. But in the midst is that, what's the architectural word? I've written it down, now it's disappeared, which holds both sides together. And I think the difference between Desmond Tutu and myself is that I believe that stone in the middle, which holds both sides together, has to be restitution. Even if it's symbolic restitution, there has to be restitution. It's not enough to speak of reconciliation, I believe, and it's not enough to admit gracefully or hesitating the truth. What is that word? Does anybody remember? It just vanished from my head. It's in the middle, it holds the two archways together. Anyway, you know the one, you know what I'm talking about. If you remove it, the archway falls, collapses completely. And I believe that is the key to genuine reconciliation, and in fact the ultimate destination of truth, to have some restitution.
Yeah, when you speak of some restitution, and you mentioned in the film that you see migration processes from Africa to Europe as kind of this larger picture, yeah, what are the measures to say, yeah, this is, or what is the criteria?
Yeah, the African continent.
Yeah, for that restitution is really happening. You say there should be some restitution.
Yes.
Could one be more precise on this? For example, the restitution in South Africa or in the colonial context, is that adequate, or?
Yeah, let me give you practical examples, that we're not just talking to something. When people, that's why in the film you saw that I didn't want to use the word reparations. I said I deliberately used the word restitution, because restitution can be symbolic, you know. Reparations, you're talking about 1 mule and how many acres in the American restitution system. I said, for instance, for the crimes which Europe has committed against the African continent, including looting the artworks of Africa, you know, really, really looting the artworks of Africa. That let you make
very
a
important
collective
aspect in Berlin context. This is a very important aspect in the Berlin context.
Yes, because when you remove a people's art is not just the manifestations of a people's spirituality, sensibility, relation to the outer world, to human relationship, everything. When you take a people's art heritage away, you're really denying them, depriving them of their humanity in a very profound way. So I said, all right, slavery, colonialism involved dehumanization. So why don't you repatriate these precipitates of the humanism of the African people to their original homes, and we'll write off everything. So that's one example of what you might call a symbolic, but at the same time material form of restitution. And there are other ways in which it can be done. You can do it, I was going to mention forgiveness of debt. I don't like the expression debt. I don't like the expression forgiveness. Both have to be defined very precisely to make it happen. But let's just say, okay, a symbolic act, repatriate all the artworks you stole from Africa, and we call it quits. That's one.
I think this is a wonderful sentence to finish our talk here. We have the opportunity to get some questions, comments out of the audience. And perhaps we collect 2, 3, and then have a second round. Where is our mic? There is a question there, I see. Oh, mic is coming.
I have a question about Negritude and truth. So I know that Negritude in the early stages is always, a lot of people have criticized Negritude for not including women in defining what it is and what it means. And I was wondering at a later time if you think, Mr. Soyinka, that it succeeded in including more female voices, because I guess as a woman, I do think that truth can only be defined by men and women and all others.
Did you catch that? Because
Yes,
I have an echo.
Negritude and woman. And
Negritude should not only be defined by men, but also women. Do you see this?
On the contrary, I'm sorry if we've sounded as if we're discussing men. I mean, when I called Senghor a rhapsodist, for instance, you couldn't keep Senghor off women. Just go through his poetry, you know, Femme Noire, everything surround them, rhythm, the sense of closeness to earth, etc.
The question, I think, is also women as actors in the movement of Negritude.
Yeah, I think that history, I mean, in the last 15 years is being rewritten. Okay. If you look, for example, at the salons in Paris, they were actually run by women, the Nardal sisters. You talk about this in your book. And if you look at the Negritude woman, there is a book called exactly that by that title. Camille, she teaches at Vanderbilt University. The title is The Negritude Woman. And it talks about the role of women in Negritude, which was erased in the 50s completely through the independence celebration. And now more and more books are coming after that book. But that's the best title I can give you right away in terms of woman role in Negritude. But in Soyinka's book, he talks about the salon that actually allowed for the incubation of Negritude movement. The Nardal sisters in Paris, this is where Alain Lac was going. This is where all the artists were going, and they met Senghor and Césaire. And the movement was created in these two sisters' salon, and one of them actually wrote a dissertation on Alain Lac. But Negritude woman probably is the easiest source. If you tap that, you will go to other areas.
Okay, other questions? Oh, everybody is happy. Yeah, only the women were a bit dissatisfied at the beginning. Yeah, so, yeah, here.
I thought there was a question there.
There's here? Okay, then, sorry. No, well, here, Hans-Christoph Buch, and then later on.
Mr. Diawara, you mentioned Leo Frobenius,
yes.
the German
anthropologist,
thinker who studied Africa before and after World War I. Had Senghor read him?
Yes.
Did he know Frobenius' work?
He wrote several essays on Frobenius and the contribution of Frobenius to the Negritude movement, yes. And he visited the Ethnography Museum here in Berlin. Yes, he knew him very well.
Here.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm over here. Thank you so much. Wole Soyinka, I wanted to ask you, if you talk of restitution in the means of, like in symbolic means, don't you think that you're also enacting a kind of neoliberal way of reparation? Because it would deny like the importance, the essential of reparations in economic means from Europe to Africa.
Did you get it?
Didn't catch.
That if you use restitution as opposed to reparation, you fall in the trap of neoliberalism because you are dismissing the economic significance of reparation. Am I getting it right? Okay.
No, I wouldn't say for a moment that the economic aspect, the economic factor, is what distinguishes my use of restitution as opposed to reparations. No, restitution for me is a more universal expression. Reparations has become a very specific, the very specific language of redressing a particular crime between Europe and Africa, or between the Arab world and Africa, very specific to those. I'm talking about the very condition of crimes against community, crimes against humanity, of which, for me, slavery itself is an example. And the enormity, because I know that economic reparations have been, the economic compensation has been tied to reparations. And the question which is always raised is, how do you go about it? All right, I mentioned briefly what has been proposed also, the forgiveness of debts. But then that becomes very complicated. How were those debts generated in the first place? How much of the impoverishment of the African continent can be laid at the door of the colonial powers, and how much of it can be laid at the door of their successors? An embarrassing catalog of succession of despoilers, not only despoilers, but criminals against their own humanity. When we get to that, and then when you make that economic, you emphasize the economic aspect, how do you sit down and calculate? I know general formulae have been made, and then how do you measure it? For me, it's such an imponderable, impossible task that I think that the admission of guilt, and this is along the principles of Ubuntu, truth and reconciliation aspect of Ubuntu, the admission of guilt, followed by a symbolic, in African method, a symbolic act of restitution. I believe that then you can add the economic aspect if you like, but I'm talking principally about just addressing the base, the foundation of that criminal relationship in order to be able to move forward into a new politics of a new culture of human relationship. That's all. I don't underestimate the economic, but it's just impossible to calculate. Yeah, how do you do it?
Okay, we can. There's over there. And perhaps one more, then we have to close.
My question is on the notion of truth in context with the dictionary of now. My question would be, because there was a philosophical movement, a pragmatist movement, and they said, well, does truth make a difference in the world? And they concluded, well, it doesn't really make a difference, so can we just abolish the notion of truth and use instead maybe justification or warranted assertability? So I wanted to ask all of you, what do you think, like, is truth and the notion of truth still a valid notion in the dictionary of now?
Good. We take that too, and then we answer, I think, very important question, yeah.
Thank you so much, all three of you. It's an honor to have you, Mr. Soyinka, in Berlin. I had two questions, one about the film, which show us a kind of essentialism and the discussion of this is the African continent and this is the European continent and so on, culture, art, and so on. As you also, I'm surely know about Martin Bernal's study of how 60% of the Greek language consists of African languages. So it was this problem with essentialism. It was one thing. And the second thing was that Fanon did not appear in this film. It seemed that his voice did not matter at all when it comes to Negritude. And it related perfectly with what Soyinka said about the contemporary Africa. Because as you know, according to Fanon, Africa was never decolonized, as what he called intermediary subjects replaced the strict colonial system that reproduced itself. This was one thing. The other was about this question of truth. I'm a genocide scholar, and we don't simply talk about the truth, we talk about justice. And my question to Soyinka is justice possible in Africa, to its history, and to those who leave Africa and die in the desert, in the sub-Saharan desert, and on the way to this continent, is just as ever possible. A symbolic restitution matter when we think about those people and not about the African states and the political system. It seemed that it takes us back to the film and the question of colonization. It appears that with this question of colonization addressed indirectly in the film, justice also is deferred, is something that is about to come and is never arriving. And it takes us to a level where we have to follow the African leaving Africa and the new liberal multi-corporations taking over the continent with their Fanonian intermediary subjects.
I missed most of that. I have this problem here. So just,
I think the relevant part of the question to Wole Soyinka, because the other part may be addressed to me, the filmmaker, because he can take blame for the film. The relevant part was, could we have the truth without justice? If I understood you well. What do we do with justice? That's what I understood, yeah.
And is there a real decolonization process possible in Africa? That's the second aspect of it.
Well, we've embarked on the journey. We've embarked on the journey. There's no question at all. I don't think any task is ever finished, ever completed. It's to say that there's a moment when decolonization, with its effects, with the effects of colonization, both cultural, economic, spiritual, very deeply penetrative. And then there is, of course, the expression neocolonization, which is very real, very concrete. And then today, we even have what I would like to call recolonization, which is largely economic and cultural. To say that that process will ever be complete, I think will be self-deception. It's not possible. It's a question of reducing it to manageable proportions where at least African nations, former colonies, can boast that they're actually in control of their day-to-day existence, their resources, that they have arrived at a stage of genuine equal partnership, so that we're no longer even talking about debt forgiveness, debt cancellation, debt rationalization, in which if you owe because the same way as entrepreneurs owe, or vice versa, business people owe banks, etc., so that it's seen as a clear technical relationship rather than a dependency syndrome in which one side dictates everything. Then there are also constant enemies of genuine independence, authentic independence, cropping up all the time. The one phrase which struck me when we were watching the film was Senghor's statement that the work of militant Negritude is just beginning. And it struck me very forcibly because Negritude, if you may just go back to that subject, has always struck me as a weapon of resistance, lying in waiting to be resurrected, to be exhumed, resumed, whenever there is any threat to what I consider the authentic being of Africans. One such menace is one that is recognized, but is not recognized as being especially pertinent to the African continent, and that is the rise of militant and sadistic religious fundamentalism, as represented by Daesh or call it Daesh, call it Ansar Deen movement in Mali, and call it Boko Haram from our own country. That a weapon, an intellectual weapon, has not yet been fashioned to be used constructively and methodically against this indoctrination, religious indoctrination, whose mission seems to be to reduce humanity to ciphers. We never thought we'd have it rearing its head on the African continent. We never thought of the possibility of Al-Shabaab in this century, or the last for that matter. We never thought that a movement would arise from within Africa which says anything at all which is not within this narrow concept of truth, if you like, is fatal to those who carry this kind of virus of knowledge. We never thought it would happen. And up to now, Africa and the black world has not, exactly like the European world also, found an intellectual alternative, a system of knowledge which appeals and to which the citizens can respond as something quite natural and belonging to themselves. Struck me just now that Negritude is one of those concepts which can be used to counter that extreme indoctrination that sees, for instance, the mission of humanity to be not on this earth, but outside of it. Because African society, African cultures, African belief systems completely repudiates such murderous garbage. And it seems that maybe it's time to resurrect Negritude and as a weapon of self-consciousness and aggressive, militant, if you like, combative self-consciousness to resist this monstrosity which is eating up our societies.
Perhaps you say something to Fanon in the context of Negritude. That was one part of the question. And the final question to all of us, should we stay with the concept of truth at all?
Yeah. Briefly, that question, I would replace truth with relation. The poetics of relation and the living is the only truth for Glissant, le vivant. Rien n'est vrai, tout est vivant. That's what Glissant said. Nothing is real, nothing is true, but everything is alive. And things stay alive through their relations with other things. So I would put relation as opposed to truth. But the question of Fanon, related to the question of essentialism, it's a difficult question to answer because I think both Senghor and Soyinka spent all his time in the film putting things in quotation marks. Put everything in their quotation. I know this, so he put quotation marks everywhere. And Senghor keeps saying it's now racial, it's cultural. But also, even if you look at people who popularize essentialist discourse in post-structuralism, like Gayatri Spivak, she will go back to strategic essentialism. Stuart Hall, toward the end of his life, his best statement to Homi Bhabha is that the sentence has to come to a stop at some point. So I thought that the essentialism question has become very easy and simple. It's no longer an attack. It's probably a way of getting rid of something. Otherwise, it's no longer relevant. So Fanon is important. Fanon, I really don't think we can have a discussion if we have to base it on essentialism. We're not going to get anywhere because philosophically, you cannot test it. But Fanon, on the other hand, why isn't Fanon in this film? I teach a class called Post-Negritude, Fanon, Glissant, and Soyinka. But I wanted a dialogue on the African context between Soyinka and Senghor. That's why Fanon is not here. If you look at the United States and probably Germany too, when you talk about Negritude, everybody talks about Fanon. So a lot has been said about Fanon, and he's dead, so there is not much I can say. You know Fanon way more than you know the discussion between Soyinka and Senghor. How many people know that book that I was mentioning? You can't even remember the title. That's why I want to bring that up and bring that in the discussion. In the US, everybody knows Fanon.
Okay.
So I'm not gonna bring anything. So that's my main.
Good.
Yeah.
Soyinka, you would like to give up with the notion of truth? We can just get rid of the notion of truth?
Once again?
Would you like to get rid of the notion of truth? Because it's not relevant anymore. And
You want to get rid of it?
I don't know, because it's a target, it's a goal, it's a quest. And I think life is all about quests. And so even if one spends one's entire existence chasing this chimera, it's still worth, I think, life of existence.
Okay, and I would add from my side to Soyinka, yeah, it's a quest, and there are different ways of truth, and one has to look at the procedures in which way they are getting established, and are they relevant or not, or adequate or not, better to say. I would stay with it. Thank you very much for the engagement and staying with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wole Soyinka Manthia Diawara. Really great. Thanks a lot. Really.
Thank you.
Very much.